Hello everyone and welcome to a brand new sketchbook tour. This is for the month of June this time around. This is Alrav from Quebec, Canada, the author and creator of Algatraz the Protector / Algatraz le Protector. And for today's topic, I wanted to talk about a little question for both readers and creators alike, anyone who are interested in jumping in comic books making or any sort of creative endeavors. How much practice do you need to actually become a comic book artist or creator? And this is a particular question to ask because for those of you who have yet to read Algatraz or check out any of my videos, I spent many years working on this in silent, away from anybody for a really long time. And so it's only until September 2025 that I actually started going online and sharing my stuff. But for a long time I did a lot of practice, such as sketchbook tours such as these, as an example, among other things. I think the best way I could answer this particular question is, I'm going to give you an example. I remember back when I was a teenager, I watched a show on television called Deadliest Warrior. So for those of you who have never watched it, basically they would bring expert scientists and other people from all over to test out the weapons and the tactics of the different historical warriors in order to then create a virtual simulation to determine who would win across 1,000 battles and such. So in the second season of that show, there was an episode in which the Nazis were put against the Viet Cong, and spoiler alert, yes, the Nazis won the simulation, but there was something interesting about these two, is that in the case, both of them were bad guys, but in the case of the Nazis, they were the sort of elite, very well trained, very disciplined warriors that they were making, so they had to. But in the case of the Viet Congs, since they were mostly guerrillas at core, they didn't have time to do any sort of training per se, so the most they could do is take a few rounds per day and make a target practice out of them. So the reason I'm bringing up this particular episode of that show is to highlight the philosophy behind it. Is that there are, just like with the artists and themselves, you can spend a lot of time practicing in sketchbooks and stuff like that, but the real practice for a comic book creator in general is being able to make the complete pages in A3 size paper and stuff. So if you spend all your time doodling on sketchbook tours, whether it's stick figures, geometry, or anything of the stuff that I have made, it can become something akin to a comfort zone in which you spend so much time practicing that there's a perfectionist in you that starts taking over, and before you know it, the productivity, the time spent on making the actual comic book, it gets slowed down or become non-existent. And so that's sort of an issue in itself, to practice too much. So I think that if you need to practice, now that I look back at this, the best way you can do so is by drawing and inking an actual comic book page that you've made and getting it out there, as the experience of doing one will then lead to another and such. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't practice your drawings or anything like that. Of course you do. It's just that you shouldn't spend hours on end practicing every little things before you are ready to make an actual comic book page because the odds are you'll never truly be ready for it. So the best way to practice would be to do something simple, like let's say if you only have, let's say, a few hours per day to work on an actual comic book, then you could probably spend about maybe between 30 to 60 minutes of practice and spend the rest of that time, an hour or two, on the actual comic book page that you want to make. So that would be the best way to go. And if doing a full comic book page in, let's say, the full A3 size paper, or in my case that's basically the two A4 size papers and stuff that are duct taped together. Well, that's called the Italian method, by the way. Well, sometimes doing a full comic book page per se can be daunting, and I remember my very first one years ago when I did my very first comic book before I did Alcatraz. And so doing a full comic book page in its entirety was very daunting at the time, and that was because I practiced so much drawings that it became my comfort zone. So that's the reason now why I do fewer practice, but I spend more time on the drawing the actual comic book page and stuff. If doing a full A3 size paper is too intimidating, then you can also opt to do something smaller like illustration or comic strips as a way of gauging your progress. And that's also a good point, because there is also a thinking about how working on small size, I think the real expression is to think big is to think small, so that must be it. When you do so, it's always easier to work on a smaller surface, like let's say the A5 size papers that are very small, such as those little note flip of sort. If you do so, it's a lot easier to manage for a beginner, but then as you become more experienced with the smaller illustrations or these comic strips, you can then move on to the larger illustrations, such as the full comic book page. In a sense, this is the sort of philosophy that made me as a creator create blog comics and all sorts of illustrations before I actually did any sort of revisit of my comic books, simply because doing these smaller illustrations is a good way of practicing before you go to the real deal. And once you become comfortable enough with larger A3 size papers and stuff, then that's when you can actually start making it as part of your ritual of drawing and productivity for days or weeks to come after that. So I really do think that in the end, it really is the experience that of drawing a comic book page and making one after the other that really matters the most. So if you only have a limited time to work on your comic book project, then make sure to prioritize the comic book page and do it a minimum amount of practice, but focus on the comic book page. And that's it for today's video, folks. So let me know what you think about this in the commentary section below. And as always, look forward to all the Alcatraz the Protector / Alcatraz the Protector stuff on my Substack. The second issue is coming out this summer, and if you haven't read it already, the first issue alongside the over 150 blog comic chapters are available on my Substack. All of this for free, and on top of that, in dual language, both English and French. So with that being said, again, thanks for watching, and we'll see one another very soon. So enjoy the reading.